is physiology of
Physiology of
speech.
speech.
Okay, so what is speech? Speech is the way we talk, the way we communicate with others. So the speech is a part of a broader term called language. So what is language? Language is by you read something, you identify the alphabets. Then what happens is you try to convey something by talking. So all that comes under your language processing. So language includes the way you identify by reading. Language means how you communicate by writing. And again, language also means how do you communicate by talking. So the speech is a portion of this language processing. So what happens is whenever you observe the brain activity in a male and a female, what happens is there is a difference in the active area. So if you see in this picture, on the right hand side is the brain activity of a woman, whereas on the left is the brain activity of a man. So what happens is whenever a woman is talking or using her language skills, they use both sides of the brain, whereas in men they use predominantly a single side of the brain. So this is important because each one, the way they approach things, the way they communicate things is different. So this is what you must understand. The activity is on both the sides in females, and it is usually to a single side in males. So why is that so? Why the activity is being split up into areas? Why it is on one side and why it is on the other side? So for that you must understand what is your language and speech and how your brain. Can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
So,
sir.
so what happens is, so whenever you discuss about language processing, the language processing involves how do you remember things. Memory is also a key part of language, and learning is also another part of the brain. But what happens is, your speech is mostly concerned to the what you call as the neocortical area. So neocortex is the newer cortex, which is not seen in your lower animals. So humans have a more developed neocortex. And what happens is in the neocortex concerning language, it includes understanding of spoken and printed words and expressing ideas in speech and writing. So this is what is lead to language processing. So language processing means understanding what is spoken by somebody else, understanding what is written and what is and expressing your ideas by talking and writing. So this is a important step in language processing. So here what happens is in each individual you have a dominant hemisphere and a non-dominant hemisphere. So the hemisphere which is considered with categorization and symbolization is called dominant hemisphere. So what is this dominant hemisphere? Can be either the right or the left. So here where you get categorization. Categorization means how do you segregate, how do you group things, and symbolization, that means how do you understand something which is there. So this is seen in the dominant hemisphere, whereas the other hemisphere is less developed in this function and it is called the non-dominant hemisphere, which is related to spatio-temporal relation. So what do you mean by spatio-temporal relation? It is understanding the dimension, understanding objects by touch, by observing the size, by observing the shape. All that comes under spatio-temporal relation. So it is like identification of objects by their form and recognition of musical tones. All these comes under your non-dominant hemisphere. Even your face recognition is also seen in the non-dominant hemisphere of your brain. So the cerebral dominance, a non-dominant hemisphere and dominant hemisphere was what was thought earlier. Now they are divided into two halves. One is called the categorical hemisphere The other one is the representational hemisphere. So what is the difference? So initially I told you, you have two halves in your brain. You have the right half and the left half. So initially it was thought to be a dominant hemisphere which controls your speech, and the other one is your non-dominant hemisphere which will help you to observe things. So now, based on the overlap of functions between both the hemispheres, now they have understood that the hemispheres are divided into categorical and representational. So what do you mean by categorical? Categorical means which analyzes the various processes in sequence. It's called sequential analytic process. So categorical means analyzing something in sequence and in analysis. So what happens is, so this is your categorical hemisphere, and the other one tries to observe things which show spatial relationship. That is why observing things and looking at the space, the dimensions of the objects, and by identifying the alphabets, you're trying to understand. That is your representational hemisphere. So this is what you must understand. So this is the brain activity. As I said, in males, the brain activity is usually for language is one-sided, single-sided, whereas in women, it is shows activity on both the hemispheres. So whenever you remember the hemispheres, you must remember that one hemisphere is responsible for categorical activity, that is called sequential and analytic processes are done through that hemisphere, whereas the other one is the representational hemisphere which relates the visual and spatial correlation with the object for identification. So this specialization leads to handedness. What do you mean by handedness? This is, you can see many people right, or their dominant hand is the right side, whereas some people you see their dominant hand is the left side. So how do you determine that? That is because of a genetical program. Genetically determined is which hand becomes the dominant. So whereas in majority of the individual, almost 96% of the people, they are right-handed. In right-handed people, the left hemisphere is the dominant or categorical hemisphere. So always remember that in right-handed individuals, the left hemisphere is the categorical hemisphere. Categorical hemisphere is the one which is responsible for sequential and analytic processes. Then in 15% of the balance of the left-handed individuals, the right hemisphere is the categorical hemisphere. However, in remaining 70% of left-handers, left hemisphere is the categorical hemisphere. So what you understand by that? Whether the individual is right-handed or left-handed, most of the human race have the left hemisphere as the categorical hemisphere. So whenever there's going to be any defect on the left hemisphere, it leads to a condition called dyslexia. So dyslexia is an impaired ability to learn, to read. Okay, so this is called dyslexia. So always remember, your left hemisphere is the categorical hemisphere in majority of the individuals. Okay, so if there is going to be any defect in the categorical hemisphere, so what I said, categorical hemisphere is the one which is responsible for your language. So if there is going to be any defect in the categorical hemisphere, the individual will not be able to read, will not be able to talk. Whereas if there is going to be a defect in the representational hemisphere, that is what I told you, which is responsible for identifying objects by touching, by observing, to know that it is a square, it is a cube, or it is a circle, it is a sphere, it is a ball. Okay, all that comes under representational hemisphere. So if there is going to be a defect, any disease in the representational area, you get what is called astereognosis. Astereognosis means inability to identify the objects by feeling them. Agnosia. Agnosia means it is the term by which they cannot identify the object by a particular sensation. So what happens is, sometimes the defect may be mild or sometimes the defect may be severe. What happens is, you can also get a unilateral inattention and neglect. So what happens is, here in this condition, their patient will have a defect on some half of their body. Say what happens is, they can understand the right half, but they cannot understand the left half, or whatever case it might be. So it's called unilateral attention and neglect. So imagine these people can lead to what they can do. They can dress half of their bodies, they can shave half of their face, and they can read only one half of the page. So this is an extreme case of unilateral inattention or unilateral neglect, like seeing that you can observe things with your right eye, but whatever is on the left side you cannot see. It is an example of diseases. Similarly, if there is going to be any disease in the dominant hemisphere, the categorical hemisphere, you get fluent, non-fluent, and anomic aphasia. Aphasia means it is a lesion in the categorical hemisphere. Categorical hemisphere is what? It is your dominant hemisphere where your language center is placed. So what happens is, based on the amount of defect in that hemisphere, you can get fluent, non-fluent, and anomic. So what happens is, if there is going to be some people are very difficult to make them smile, or some people have very difficulty in telling a story, some people find difficulty in telling jokes. So all these, what happens, could be a aphasia. Okay, so here what happens, so you have to understand that in your brain, one half of the brain is categorical, which is responsible for the language processing. The other half is representational, which tries to observe things and come to a conclusion. Okay, so this is what is important. Whenever you try to remember language, always remember that there is a dominant or a categorical hemisphere, and there is a non-dominant or a representational hemisphere in your brain. Okay, is that clear? Any doubts till now?
No, sir.
Okay, so whenever you're dealing about physiology of speech, you always try to remember this diagram. Okay, so what happens is, in your brain, there are 4 steps which you must know. Okay, one is the vernix area, the angular gyrus, arcuate fasciculus, and the Broca area. So what happens is, these are the areas in the categorical hemisphere that are concerned with the language function. So what is this categorical hemisphere? That's what I told you. It is the dominant or the left hemisphere in individuals where your language functions are placed. So what happens is, Wernicke area is the one which is here. Behind that you have the angular gyrus, and you have an arcuate fasciculus, which is nothing but a connection of nerves which communicates from this vernix area to the Broca's area. So what happens is, Broca's area processes the information received from vernix area, and it is responsible for projecting this information to the motor cortex. So what does the motor cortex do? Motor cortex is the one which will instruct the muscles of the lips, muscles of the tongue, muscles of the face, and the larynx to produce speech. So always remember, whenever there is going to be somebody is going to talk, this speech does not come directly. So what happens is, the signal he has to observe first. So he has to hear something, he has to smell something. Okay, so the other senses should be intact. So main thing is, he has to hear something before he starts to talk. So what happens is, the sensory impulses from the vernix area is transmitted via this arcuate fasciculus to the Broca's area, which analyzes the input and it instructs the motor cortex to move. So this motor cortex, what does it do? It initiates the movements of the lips, the tongue, the face, and the larynx to produce speech. So if there's going to be any defect in the communication, you end up with difficulty in speaking. Okay, so this is a path by which the impulses generate speech. So what happens is, the path taken by impulses are given here, starting from 1. So what is 1? The 1 is, information travels from the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus to the primary visual cortex to higher order visual critical areas and to the angular gyrus. Okay, so what happens is, whatever you are observing transmits to the visual cortex. So whatever you are seeing, So whatever you are hearing comes to the vernix area. So what happens is from there, these signals are transmitted through the arcuate fasciculus. So this arcuate fasciculus transmits the signals from the vernix area to the Broca's area. So this Broca's area sends a signal to the facial area of the motor cortex, which leads to speech. So always remember this sequence. Okay, so you have signals coming from the lateral geniculate nucleus. It goes to the primary visual cortex. From the primary visual cortex, it goes to the higher order visual cortical areas. From the higher visual cortical areas, it comes to the angular gyrus. From the angular gyrus, information goes to the vernix area, and from the vernix area through the arcuate fasciculus, it goes to the Broca's area, and from the Broca's area, the signal is processed and it's transmitted to the facial area of motor cortex, which is responsible for stimulating or initiating the movement of the facial muscles, lips, tongue, and the larynx to produce speech. So, is that clear? Any doubts in this? So, whenever you think of speech, you must always remember that it is related to the other senses. So, you have to visualize or you have to hear in order to process these signals, and the signals are transmitted to the motor cortex from where the muscle movement takes place. So, what happens is you have various language disorders. So, aphasia is an abnormality of the language function that are not due to defect of vision or hearing or any motor paralysis, because sometimes when you have defects in seeing, your speaking or language, because if eyes are not seen, you will not be able to identify any alphabets. Similarly, if you cannot hear, you will not be able to respond properly. And if you're going to have a paralysis of the muscles, again you will not be able to speak. If these three reasons are ruled out, there's going to be any other problem in the brain which leads to difficulty in identifying alphabets, difficulty in writing alphabets, or difficulty in communicating with language, it comes under aphasia. So this aphasia, usually it is either due to a block or a clot in the brain. So it is an embolism or thrombosis of a cerebral blood vessel. So it is responsible for your these aphasia. So these aphasia, as I told you, there are three types, which is your non-fluent and fluent and anomic aphasia. So what is non-fluent? Non-fluent means the lesion is in the Broca's area. So where in the cycle the Broca's area comes where? As I told you,
Before
Broca's
the
area
before the
is
motor,
the one
before
which
the
communicates the signals to the motor cortex. So what happens is there's going to be a difficulty or a disease in the Broca's area. The speech is slow, the words are hard to come by. Okay, so what happens is if there's going to be a defect in the Broca's area, I told you the Broca's area sends a signal to the motor cortex. If there's going to be any defect in the Broca's area, they will not be able to identify the and communicate the language properly. So if there is going to be a lesion in the vernix area, what happens is the speech is normal, whereas the patient will talk excessively. Okay, or they speak some words which is not understandable, which is not legible. So if there's going to be disease in the Broca's area, the patient will not be able to speak properly. Words are very less. Whereas there is going to be disease in the vernix area, patient will keep on talking, because vernix area is also related to hearing. So what happens is if there is going to be there is no feedback on what you are talking, so you end up with speaking something else which is not legible, not understandable, and it creates a lot of problems later on. Okay, sometimes you also get this condition called conduction aphasia. So what is this conduction aphasia? The patient can talk, patient can hear, but what happens is he cannot put words properly. So when he cannot put the words properly, usually the problem is in the arcuate fasciculus. So what is the arcuate fasciculus? It is the connection which transmits signals from the vernix area to the Broca's area. So here what happens is, even though there is not a major problem in hearing or there is a main problem in the brain, what happens is because of this connection issues, he cannot communicate it properly. So if there is going to be a lesion in the angular gyrus, so what happens is here the visual information is not processed and transmitted to the vernix area. It is called anomic aphasia. So as I told you, what is this angular gyrus? Angular gyrus is responsible for processing your visual signal. That is when you see some alphabets, see some written matter in your textbook or in your newspaper or in TV, so you are not able to identify what it is. So that is called anomic aphasia. Sometimes you also see a condition where aphasia is general. It is called global aphasia. In global aphasia, what happens is they cannot receive any language impulses and they also cannot express any language impulses. So the last one is called stuttering. You would have seen people who cannot say, they will say zzz, they say lul. So the some words keep stressing, some syllables repeats. So this stuttering usually is seen due to overactivity in the cerebral cortex. So sometimes what happens is this area, some people also they laugh without any, what you say, a valid or a logical reason. So this is a stuttering, is also called stammering, where what happens is some syllables are stressed more and this leads to a difficulty in communication. So whenever you think of speech, you must always remember how the hemispheres are. You have a categorical hemisphere, which is usually the left in majority of the humans. So this left hemisphere is called the categorical hemisphere, which is responsible for sequential and analytic action. Then you also have the other hemisphere, which is the representational hemisphere, which is responsible for identification of objects by identifying the size, shape, volume, etc. So whenever there is going to be a difficulty in language processing, it is usually on the categorical hemisphere, which leads to a condition called aphasia. Whereas if there's going to be a defect in the representational hemisphere, it is called agnosia. Agnosia. Agnosia is inability to identify the objects by seeing them, whereas aphasia is inability to communicate. So what happens is all the visual impulses comes from the lateral geniculate nucleus, goes to the primary visual cortex. From there, the signals are processed to the higher order visual cortical areas. From there, the signals are transferred to the angular gyrus. Similarly, other impulses also are transmitted to the vernix area. So from the vernix area, the signals are transmitted to the Broca's area through the arcuate fasciculus. So once the signal comes to the Broca's area, it is transmitted to the facial area of the motor cortex, which is responsible for initiating movement of the lips, the tongue, and the larynx to produce speech. If there's going to be any defect somewhere in this sequence of cycles, you end up with a condition called aphasia. Aphasia can be fluent, non-fluent, or anomic. Anomic means patient cannot able to identify the language or the pictures because the visual information is not processed. If it's going to be a non-fluent or a fluent aphasia, there is a condition in the conduction pathways inside the brain. Stuttering is where some people keep repeating few alphabets repeatedly while trying to communicate, is due to overactivity in the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so this 40 minutes is going to get over, so I will relog in again so you can ask me any doubts if you have. Okay.